Welcome to our home and to our Monday Supper. We're coming to you at a new time. We moved our live stream from Sunday afternoon to Monday evening because, well, it's almost summer, and we know many of you would rather be outside on the weekends. Today, we'll talk about the wave of crime that's washing over our state, the theft of several hundred millions of dollars from the Employment Security Department by cybercriminals, and the riots that have erupted in our cities following the tragic death of a Black man at the hands of police officers in Minneapolis. My family is originally from Minnesota, and I have lots of relatives there, so I share their pain on this. For this conversation, we're joined by former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Washington, James McDevitt, who was appointed to that post by President George W. Bush. As U.S. Attorney, Jim investigated fraud in our state government, and he tried and convicted a police officer for a civil rights felony crime. More recently, in 2016, Jim was the civilian leader of the Spokane Police Department. We're also joined by former state representative and cybersecurity expert, Mark Harmsworth. As a legislator, Mark helped write some of our state's online privacy statutes, and he now runs a business that provides cybersecurity services. Now, I'll turn it over to my husband, Mike, who's running for Attorney General to protect all of us in our evergreen state.
Thank you, Camille, and hello, everyone. Our state is facing an outbreak of crime and lawlessness like we haven't seen in generations. Cyber criminals have robbed the state, and cities are under curfew. In fact, we received a robocall at our house just a few hours ago telling us about a curfew. We have just been the victim of one of the biggest heists of all time. It was many times bigger than the Great Train Robbery or any of those pulled off by the Butch Cassidy and the Hole in the Wall gang. The state admits cyber criminals stole hundreds of millions of dollars from our Employment Security Department, but it hasn't said how much, only that it has recovered 300 million of it back. While other states have also been robbed, Washington state was the #1 target and the hardest hit. When I announced my run for Attorney General, I said that I would focus on protecting the evergreen state from cyber threats like these. Attorney General Bob Ferguson has been too busy to do so with his obsession of bringing partisan lawsuits against the president, now numbering more than 58. He discontinued the AG's high-tech crimes unit that Christine Gregoire formed and Rob McKenna carried on that helped governments address cybercrime threats. So tonight we'll talk about Washington State's great cyber robbery with former legislator and current cybersecurity expert Mark Harmsworth and former U.S. Attorney James McDevitt. Jim and I will also talk about the death of a Black man under the custody of the Minneapolis police that has led to rioting in many cities, including Seattle. As U.S. Attorney, Jim tried and convicted a police officer for a civil rights felony crime, and he was a civilian leader of the Spokane Police Department in 2016. Mark, let's start with you. Are you there with us?
I should be. Can you see me?
I'm not seeing you, but I do hear you. Josh, are we seeing him?
There you go.
Got him. Okay.
Well, it's this wonderful new world of video conferencing that we've now been exposed to for the last 60 days. It's just, and we should all be experts by the end of this. And
yes, well, I can't wait till it's over, but
yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
From your home. What do we know and what do we not know about the theft of money from our state's Employment Securities Department?
Well, it's a little difficult to get a straight answer out of the Employment Security Department on fund balances and the amount that they're actually spending. If for those that aren't familiar with the way the Unemployment Benefit Fund works, there's a federal component and there's a local state component. And when if you lose your job and you're on unemployment and you're claiming that money from the state will give you your monthly payment. But part of that, about 2/3 is what we're seeing comes from the federal government and about 1/3 from the state, at least in this COVID situation. Normally it's a little different ratio, but that's basically how it works. The fund started this year at about 4.8, 4.9 billion. That's with a B, dollars. And the employment division has been spending at about, depending on the week, between 700 and over $1 billion per week. So for those of you who can add fairly quickly, because the rudimentary math is going to come to you there, you can see that they're going to run out of money relatively quickly. Now, the federal government's replenishing some of that money through the COVID CARES Act, and the local businesses that are still able to actually work under the lockdown are able to pay into that at a much reduced rate. But that fund balance is going down. And then on top of that, as you've heard, we had the Nigerian scam, which filed several hundred million, if not 300 million in fraudulent claims against the account, which has reduced it still further. And this is important because as that fund balance comes down, there comes a point where the state has to replenish it to stay solvent. And the way they do that is either through general fund contributions, which they're not going to have much of right now, or they have to take a federal loan from the US government, federal government, which California just did to the tune of 12 billion, a line of credit effectively, and they borrowed 340 million in the first week. Washington will end up doing something similar if we get down too low. That money has to be repaid, and that falls on the backs of the taxpayers of Washington state.
Washington was hit, but were we the only state that was targeted?
No, there were several other states that saw some fraud, but by far Washington has the largest amount of fraud. And I think that comes down to the way in which the systems that the state has are not as secure as they need to be in identifying who you are and the type of claims that you can have on unemployment. And that fundamentally is a breakdown in the way in which the department has been run for the last 18 months.
And I've read that the cyber theft and efforts to deal with it have caused some people to not get their unemployment benefits. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah. So in today's world, we all know about the cloud and the features that offers as far as security. If you're trying to do security on your own and you're a small independent contractor or a small business, then it doesn't make sense. You should be thinking about the cloud because there's hundreds and hundreds of engineers that are focused on security. What the cloud also gives you is something called scalability. So as you build your systems out to support load, if you build your system to support the maximum load in computer parlance, you're going to spend a lot of money on equipment, and it's going to cost you a lot of money to run it. But with the cloud, you're able to buy a small amount, and then as demand increases, you can easily scale and add more capacity. It's called more compute. Now, the state is, I believe, on the cloud, and they should be able to do that, but they obviously hadn't engineered the systems to do that. So as people started applying in mass numbers for unemployment benefits, the system was very quickly overwhelmed, not just the computer systems, but also the phone systems and just the processes that you had to go through to get to the unemployment. And as a result, because the state didn't want to not pay out, it relaxed its security. And that's where you saw the problem with the Nigerians coming in using potentially, and we don't know this for sure yet, but potentially a different data breach that's happened in the past through somewhere else like Equifax, or you can imagine the Target. I'm not saying those were the breach points, but it could have been either of those two where social security number, name and address were available to these hackers, and they can put that together and just start applying. If you go to the ESD website, you'll see how easy it is to actually start the application. And you can see how easy it was for them to just start the application on your behalf and claim all those dollars.
Okay, now you're a cybercrime expert. In fact, I think you told me you run a cybercrime firm, or a firm that does cybercrime consulting work, and you were a state legislator. What would you be telling the state it needs to do right now? And then when this is over, what should the state be doing in the future to be more secure and less susceptible to a great cyber robbery like this one?
Well, the first thing I would do is hire somebody, whether that's internal inside the state, because there are divisions within the state. There's some good IT people within the state infrastructure, or an external company, to go through and do an audit of the systems and figure out if there's any potential direct attack breaches. This particular breach, you would call it more of a social engineering breach, because it was based on external data and folks went in to get the money. The second thing I would do is have that on a regular basis for something what's called a penetration test, where an external company is looking to try to break the state systems and looking to figure out how to sort of find those little holes and do this. And this should have been done a long time ago. We've just spent around $44 million over the last few years upgrading these systems. That should have been number one on the list, is how do we make this secure? The second thing is, and the analogy I want to use here to help is think about banks. When you go to a bank and set up an account, you get the thing on the phone, the number on the phone, the two-factor authentication it's called on your phone, or you use an authenticator app. And there's two ways to identify who you are. The state system, as it stood at the beginning of February, did not have that in place. So you could just open an account, punch in your email address, and you would get the information for the money. So that's a fundamental problem. And that is structural deficiency in the way the cybersecurity works within that system. That should have been built in ahead of time, so that when we hit a situation like this, and heaven forbid we ever see the big earthquake, we could see this again, that the system is able to support that securely. Now, subsequent to that, the state is now going back and re-asking, and now you're seeing people who can no longer get their payments because they can't prove who they are anymore. So you can see how the whole thing just sort of broke down, and then COVID exacerbated the situation.
The current Attorney General discontinued the high-tech crimes unit that Christine Gregoire created. Attorneys General in other states like California have created cybercrime units more recently. What do you think about my idea or my goal of creating a cybercrime unit in our AG's office to try to head these things off in the future?
I think it's a good idea. We are in a high-tech environment now, even more so in the last couple of months, where we're now absolutely depending on technology to do our banking, to do, in many cases, our shopping as well, for everything, not just Amazon, but our grocery shopping for some folks, and then moving data around. I'm going through a refinance on my mortgage right now, and I'm interacting with my mortgage broker, and it has to be done in a secure way. And if you don't do it securely, you do open yourself up to these types of attacks. And having a high-tech crimes unit within the Attorney General's office who specializes in looking at these types of not just security, but privacy, and there is a difference between the two there. And then how personal data is protected when you start thinking about GDPR, the California statutes that have been passed recently around data protection, and then the new Washington Privacy Act, which nearly made it out this year out of the Senate. That's going to be back next year, likely to be passed is my guess. And that puts specific requirements on companies that the AG's office is going to need to assist with, helping companies stay compliant with that law. So it's going to be really important that you have technical specialists that come out of the industry that understand what this is and also understand the law as well. And that's going to be critical.
When I announced my Attorney General campaign 2 months ago, it wasn't that long ago, it seems like forever, one of the things I said I would do is focus on cybercrime. And I heard back from a lot of folks, ho-hum, not very exciting. But I kept talking about it because I thought it was very, very important for all the reasons you just mentioned. It's really unfortunate it takes a great cyber robbery like this to put a highlight on a basic thing that our state government and our Attorney General should be doing. But here we are talking about it. Thank you, Mark. We'll come back to you for some closing thoughts in just a minute. Let's turn to former U.S. Attorney James McDivitt. Jim, are you with us? Not hearing him.
He's muted.
Jim, you might need to unmute. There, maybe, is that you?
Yep, you can hear that.
How's that?
Yeah, okay, there you go. Jim, you investigated a scheme to defraud the state when you were U.S. Attorney. Can you tell us a little bit about that investigation and what you learned that may have made the state, in that instance, vulnerable that might have applied to the most recent attack?
Well, let me correct that just a little bit. While I was the United States Attorney, I prosecuted 2 cases against DSHS contractors, and I can talk about that in a second. Within a month after I stepped down as U.S. Attorney, in about January of 2011, Governor Gregoire, through the head of the Department of Social Health Services, the state was getting just killed on a King 5 investigation of EBT, electronic benefit fraud. And so Governor Gregoire, through the head of DSHS, engaged me as outside counsel to do an internal investigation of DSHS to try to find out why it was happening and what could be done. I think, and again, I would only say this in the context of DSHS, but I have no reason to believe that the same thing isn't true, and that is that the philosophy was really to lean forward in the benefit side, give everybody the best opportunity, use a kind of not trying to belittle it, but a caregiver mentality, a social worker mentality, but they did not mix that with the notion that anytime you put a lot of money out there, like in the case of these EBT cards, you'd have people, there were instances where an individual would lose, quote unquote, lose an EBT card 18 times in 1 month. That meant he lost the card and the PIN that went with it. And they just kept going over and over. And they looked at each one of these cases. Well, it's only so much money. It's only $100. It's only $200. It's only $1,000. So what does it matter? Well, the problem was, just as in this case, by the time you tally it all up, it's in the millions. And in this particular case with EBT cards, it was in the tens of millions of dollars. So there's I don't want to say that there's a lack of a prosecutorial mentality mindset, but there's a lack of the notion that anytime you put a lot of money out there and ask people to only take what they need, there's a lot of people out there that are going to take big advantage of you. And so just as Mark said, you've got to build, before you give out the first penny, you've got to build these safeguards in, even at the front end, if it delays slightly the receipt of benefits. Otherwise, you get what exactly happened.
Our current U.S. Attorney, Brian Moran, has been critical of the state's response to the theft. But state leaders have really pushed back, basically saying Brian should have remained silent. Why do you think Brian Moran spoke out, and was that the right thing for him to do?
Absolutely. And you got to remember, and this is interesting because the 2 cases that my office pursued, a Tri-Cities contractor who ripped off DSHS for $250,000 and the Mattawa daycare case, I had pushback from DSHS. And I even had to threaten the head of DSHS to appear before the grand jury in Spokane to get cooperation. They're very, very, I think part of it is embarrassment. Part of it is, and this is my opinion, and only my opinion, a lack of a good, healthy working relationship between the state AG and the U.S. Attorney. Anytime there is a single federal dollar that flows through these programs, as it does in this case, that gives the United States Attorney absolute jurisdiction to pursue this case. Now, ideally, he or she does it hand in hand with state authorities. And I'm not surprised that there's some pushback. I had the same thing in 2006 and 2008. So I'm not surprised. It's an unhealthy relationship, and it should be better. You should be partners in the case of criminal investigation, not adversaries. So Brian was absolutely within his right to be critical, and I can't speak for Brian, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's an investigation being teed up right now.
For those of you that are just joining us, that was James McDivitt, the former United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Washington, appointed by President George W. Bush. And also with us on the live stream is Mark Harmsworth, a former state legislator who runs or owns a cyber security company. And so, Jim, let me start with you and just see if you have any other thoughts on where you think this issue, the theft of several hundred millions of dollars from the state, may be headed next. And Mark, I'll give you the last word on this subject before we move on to the next one. So go ahead, Jim.
Well, hopefully, Mike, there's a joint investigation. The federal government, probably at least 60 to 70% of every crime that my office in the 9 years, 7 under President Bush, 2 years under President Obama, probably 60 to 70% of every crime had some cyber element to it, whether it were drug transactions, white collar fraud, Medicare fraud, Medicaid, et cetera, et cetera. So it is very, very important. And the federal government, through the various agencies, FBI, Secret Service, have some absolutely outstanding cyber capabilities. And hopefully that's where it goes, in a partnership between the AG's office, between state and federal authorities. That's the way it should go. I can't tell you whether it is or isn't. We'll just have to find out.
Okay, and Mark, as a former legislator who helped write the laws on cyber laws, we'll call it, broadly, and as an expert in the field, any last thoughts on where this is headed next, or anything else that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I'll answer it in two parts. I think the first part is the legislature is very likely to want to review the situation. I suspect you'll see some studies done by JLARC, who are going to look into the management of the fund and what the legislature may need to do. You may see some directive correction in state law from the legislature to try and reform and do some other things within the fund to sort of put it into smaller buckets so it becomes a lot more difficult to commit fraud on it. I would also expect the agency itself, as I mentioned earlier, to bring in an auditing company to take a look at this, make recommendations, and then go back to the legislature and say, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to solve this problem. From a security perspective, going back to what I was talking about earlier with two-factor authentication, that is not the be-all and end-all for this, but it definitely needs to be something that has to be improved. And as James said, that has to be done right up front. You can't do this retroactively, because by the time it's the tooth out of the toothpaste situation, once you've started issuing those checks to folks, it's difficult to put it back, if not impossible to back in. So you need to better identify people. Now, every small business owner in the state works with the Secretary of State and the Department of Revenue to pay their quarterly B&O taxes. That is a secure method of doing that. You have to go through some upfront identification and prove who you are. It does take a little longer upfront, but once you've got that solid connection, you know that your money is going to the right place. So there has to be some reform there that's done from the department, and they need better security as well. I mean, in this online age, this is not hard to do. You just have to pay attention and make sure you dot your I's and cross your T's.
Well, I don't think we've heard the last of this. The state says it has recovered $300 million. What it hasn't said is how much money was stolen. And I know some very smart people that think it's going to be a lot more than 300 million, but we don't know. And stay tuned, I guess, on this one. And thank you very much, Mark Harmsworth, former state representative and cybersecurity expert. Jim, let's now turn our focus to the tragic death of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis police. You have a unique perspective because as U.S. Attorney, you charged and convicted a police officer for civil rights crimes. Can you tell us how your views of the George Floyd death are shaped by your experience?
Be happy to. Let me go back on the last subject, talking about cooperation. I was very privileged during my 9 years as U.S. Attorney to work very closely with Christine Gregoire and with Rob McKenna. And I can't tell you how good the relationship was, especially post 9/11 with Governor Gregoire, and then on through until 2010 with both Governor Gregoire, or then Attorney General Gregoire, and Rob McKenna. Excellent working relationship, and that's the key. With respect to this, the current, I have a couple thoughts. One is that the rule with the Department of Justice is that in the case of a local issue, like the current one, or as in the case of the police officer that we initiated investigation and prosecution, the first rule is you let the local authorities handle it and you watch it. And you trust the local authorities to do the right thing. But if the case is such a high visibility case as in the current one, or there is any indication that there is, that for whatever reason, local law enforcement is passing the buck, ducking their responsibility, then it is incumbent on the United States Attorney to step in, especially on a civil rights violation where a couple of them. One would be a felony, and the other and death in custody, and then there's even a more serious one that would carry a civil rights violation, death in custody, that could carry a life sentence. But when in the case of a crime, let's say a civil rights crime like this, when it's too politically hot, when the local authorities are not doing their job, when there's such a public outcry, then it is appropriate for the U.S. Attorney to step in, the Department of Justice to step in, as a matter of trying to instill confidence in the system, in the legal system. The U.S. Attorney answers to the Attorney General and the President. So there's a pretty direct line. You're not subject to local politics. You cannot be subject to local politics. And that should be something that gives the public, provided that it's done right, the confidence that these cases are being looked at and going to be prosecuted the way they should be prosecuted.
Okay, and you're kind of in a unique position because you were also the civilian head of the Spokane Police Department many years after you prosecuted the police officer. How does a police agency and how do its officers approach a death like George Floyd's?
I'm a very, very staunch supporter of law enforcement, but I'm also a staunch supporter of when you have somebody who steps out of line, and you have to have your review boards, your civilian review, your internal review for use of force issues. You've got to have, whenever there's a use of force and for example, a death in custody, you immediately have to go, as in the case of Spokane, where the sheriff's office and the state patrol step in and the city police steps out. You've got to have that credibility. 99.9% of the officers want to do a good job. But that 0.1% of 1%, you've got to make it very clear throughout the entire department that if you have that problem, which, as you can see currently, casts a shadow on the entire department or police in general, you have to be seen as being tough and immediate consequences for folks who violate the rules, who violate the civil rights, who break department policy. I mean, it's tough but fair. That's the only way to do it.
Jim McDivitt, who, as a U.S. attorney, prosecuted a police officer, and then he was the civilian head of a police agency. Jim, let me ask you this. We've seen peaceful protests, but we've also seen rioting and violence around the country and around our state on this issue. What would you say to those who are taking to the streets?
number one, the peaceful protest, the police are there to ensure the public safety, and the peaceful protests are meaningful. They send a message. They are necessary. They're part of this nation's backbone. They're part of our DNA. However, rioting, destroying property, destroying the very neighborhoods that have the most to lose, absolutely, in my view, and it's my view alone, or this is me, and I'm not speaking for everybody else. You've got to lay down the rules, and you've got to lay down the rules of the peaceful protest. You got to make very, very clear that as soon as the windows start breaking, police cars start, being torched, bottles and rocks and the like thrown at police, then you're going to have to start making arrests, start clearing the streets, and declaring curfews, because that is not that dishonors the very individual for whom you're protesting. And in my view, it turns people away, and it makes people very, very fearful for their own public safety. So the protests and the meaningful protests, those are absolutely necessary. I welcome those. I've seen those. I've encouraged those. But as soon as the rioting and as soon as the law breaking starts, then it's time to start making arrests.
Well, thank you, Jim. I'll close now with a few thoughts of my own on this subject. While there was no noose swinging from a tree, the video of George Floyd's murder reminded us of when Black men were lynched without trial, and it reminds us that much bigotry remains today. I didn't need to see the video. As the only white person hired into an all-Black Chicago law firm when I was in law school, I saw firsthand the injustice many live with. I understand why there is so much anger, but selfish violence does not spread justice. Riots, violence, and vandalism do not honor George Floyd. These acts only divide us at a time our community needs to be working together to prevent this kind of injustice in the future. As your Attorney General, I will rely on my decades of experience as a professional lawyer, not a partisan politician, to protect everyone in the Evergreen State. In Seattle, I saw street crime every day for years. It's one of the reasons I'm running to be your Attorney General. Tolerance of criminals is not progressive. It is destructive. It weakens our community. The law not treating everyone equally is destructive. It weakens our community. The law failed George Floyd. Let's honor him by committing ourselves to equality and by taking action to ensure that it will not happen here and that it will never happen again. Thank you for joining our Monday Supper. Thanks to our two guests, James McDivitt, former United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Washington and civilian head of the Spokane Police Force, and to former state representative and cybersecurity expert, Mark Harmsworth. You can learn more about my campaign to protect the Evergreen State on our just launched new website, which looks terrific. Go to mikevasca.com. Thank you very much for joining us.